Hi, I'm Fuji and I'm going to be showing you how I created this piece. It's sort of a fun take on still life drawing, and I've just tried to add like a contemporary twist to what is the kind of classic vase and flower, though I'm not sure if this counts as a flower, but you get my gist. And really wanting to emphasise the importance of composition. And maybe in terms of techniques, if you've not used it before, then I might be introducing you to masking fluid. So these four are a really good example of the sort of thing I'm trying to go for today. And it's a very kind of concentrated detail in the leaves and the flowers, and then contrasting that totally are these kind of big chunky shapes which actually emphasise how delicate the natural element is. And also it's nice that sort of nature and then contrasting that against something so designed. It's something that I use in a lot of my work. So pieces like this, it's a very bold contrast between like the little delicate parts here. So we really want to play with balance. For example, this piece is quite out there in terms of the layout, and we're going to try and see how we can use space to also emphasise the details and kind of draw your eye in and make it quite interesting. So this is the subject that we'll be drawing, and it's a very structured plant, but at the same time it's very delicate, and whilst there is lots of detail, it's quite repetitive and in some ways quite simple to draw, which is quite nice. So I always start a piece by doing a number of rough sketches first, and firstly I'll just draw a bunch of boxes, portrait, landscape, square, and then I also like to do a little sketch of the subject because it's nice to have just a 2D reference which you look at. And then from there it's just about trying out different kind of positions that it could go to on the page, just having fun play, be very rough as the sketches. The rougher you are, in a way, you're kind of willing to go more bold and just experiment with it because you're not invested. So you can put it to the side, maybe to add a bit of structure at the bottom you can put a table down and it could just be a block colour, you don't need to add details, or even like a real close-up. So that's really great for when you're doing a bouquet or something and you don't want to draw the whole thing. If you are going to go in the centre, which there's nothing wrong with, there's still ways as well that you can maybe play with the composition, adding a dark background so that your subject pops in the middle and it's really, you're drawn to it in a way. And with a landscape, if you're doing something that's got a very vertical structure, you can fill the space more by adding a wide shadow and maybe a little bit of background. So this is actually the structure or layout that I actually ended up going with, and it's off to the side, so we're only drawing half of the vase and plant, and then I've filled in the background so that we can really make the delicate little leaves pop. When it comes to sketching out your composition, I find it easier to draw around a piece of paper to get the sort of square border, and that especially helps when you're using a paper like this, which is very uneven on the edges and therefore I can't measure in from the side. The actual paper that I'm using is handmade. It's very warm and textured, which means it's quite forgiving actually, so if you've got like a slightly wobbly line, it's fine. Other papers that I've used like it are the Caddy Cotton Rag. What I like is the contrast when the imagery drawn is actually very contemporary. But I do still like to use quite like smooth papers as well. It's very clean and modern, and that has its own totally separate charm. And alternatively, you can find something which is sort of in between and has a little bit of texture, but it's still quite uniform and tidy, and you can find most suppliers have a paper like this and it's a pleasure to work with. So back to the sketching. keep it quite tidy. I don't like for it to be too messy. I'm try not to overdo my sketches, as it can get confusing later on when I'm actually drawing on top. In this case, I'll be drawing over with masking fluid, and I'll be using a ruling pen in order to do that. And ruling pens are such useful tools. I can even apply like the medium that you use for gold leaf down with that, but they're adjustable, so you can adjust the thickness. I've got quite a sharp one, and that's because it helps getting the kind of very fine lines, which, as you can see, we'll need for this plant, which is very delicate at the edge. So when it comes to drawing this, I try to keep it very angular and also intentionally uneven. I wanted it to feel very organic, so it's alright that the line's a little bit wobbly and it's not perfect. That's what I want. So you can see that my sketch underneath is actually very simple. It's sort of almost kind of the bare bones of the image, and from there I'll add extra little bits of the sort of fluffy, spindly details. And I'm not always actually following the lines because I drew it a bit more uniform than I would like, so occasionally in some places I've just strayed away from it and cut bits off. It's quite damaged actually in certain places, the plant is. I would definitely be careful of being too tidy. You don't want it to be too crisp and everything perfect in the right direction. When it comes to these little bits, I really don't know what to call them. They go in like multiple directions, so maybe the easiest way is really just to go one direction first and then go over it kind of randomly backwards again in all sorts of directions, the little lines. The process is a bit repetitive because it's all part of the same plant in the end, and there's no other sorts of things going on, but it's actually very effective and it doesn't take too long. You may notice that there's a bit of clumping in the centre. That's not actually a problem. That helps actually create extra levels and a bit more depth. Otherwise everything would be sort of just looking like thin crisscrossy lines, which wouldn't be nice. For the stems, you can go a little bit thicker with the lines, and again keeping things angular and uneven. The type of masking fluid that I use is blue. You can get a cream one as well, but I find that blue's easier to see. The only problem is that it can sometimes stain your paper, which isn't particularly great. So that is something to be aware of, and I think some papers are more likely to get stained than others. I also wanted to mention the different ways that you can use masking fluid. So in this case, I'm using it to actually draw the imagery itself, but you can use it to create all sorts of textures. One example is when I created a sort of splattered effect, and that almost gave that kind of old and kind of like dappled light effect through the image. Another example was creating that kind of light reflection that you get on glass, and anything that requires sort of fine light lines, really, it's useful for. Water's also really great because you can get that kind of soft and rippled light going across it. It's important to wait for the masking fluid to be completely dry before you start working over it. So it will actually be drying at different kind of speeds, and some bits will dry really quickly, but you've got to wait for those kind of clumps to completely go to that same kind of sort of clear texture. Once it is ready, you can start applying your ink or watercolour, whichever you're using. I'm using a pigment fineliner for the outlines, and that's because pigment fineliners don't bleed, or at least decent ones don't bleed from water. And it just helps with keeping things tidy. If you're doing this, say, in like a coloured ink and you don't have a fine liner in that colour, then that's fine, as long as you've made sure your pencil line is very tidy and you know exactly where to go up to, and as long as you've got a relatively steady hand, you'll be totally okay. But Personally, I like to just do that outline to just keep things sharp. In terms of filling in with the ink, it's generally best to go from one side first. So choose a corner or side and just start working from there, and that's because we want to avoid the sort of highlighter overlap effect. So working from one side to the other. This actually uses up a lot of ink, and I know I'm using this little small pot, but I actually have a big bottle which I fill up the small bottle with, and that's just because it's much easier to use these little ink wells. I actually did one layer, and then after removing the masking fluid realised I needed a second layer, so I would suggest you do 2 layers first. And so what that would mean is you would fill everything in black first and then wait for it to all be touch dry, and then you can go over and work over it with a second layer of ink. And it doesn't have to be solid ink, you can water it down if you want to. It just really helps to keep things looking sharper. But you might quite like that textured effect, so 1 layer could be fine depending on your preferences, or if you're working in colour, maybe that's fine as well. But in ink, I definitely prefer to have 2 layers, as it just feels a bit tidier and more intense. The brush that I'm using to fill everything in is just a relatively wide flat brush, and the reason I'm using a brush with a flat head is that it just makes it easier to apply the ink up to the straight line. I tend to use quite a lot of different types of brushes in my work, and I do think it's worthwhile having those multi-pack sets where they have the different types of brushes. So at the moment I'm just about to draw some of the details on the vase. I quite like to make the man-made elements intentionally very designed looking, and that will contrast more with the natural element, which contrast is something that's really important to me and is a big part of how I make decisions in terms of the composition in my work. When doing straight lines, I tend to outline it first with the ruler and pen, and then I'll fill it in with a very fine brush. I actually changed the design of this part here because it didn't look quite right. This is very normal, even when I've got things planned out, I usually end up changing something. Now, possibly one of the most important things is that you've, again, really got to wait, but this is a longer wait than with the masking fluid. You want to wait at least maybe like an hour for the ink to completely dry, not just touch dry, but you can really feel that the paper's dry. Otherwise what can happen is that when you're rubbing off the masking fluid is that you can actually end up tearing the paper and kind of rubbing off some of the ink with it. So you can see here I'm just kind of gently-ish taking off the masking fluid, and I'm using this frisk or mask away or masking fluid eraser, whatever it's called. And you can see how the masking fluids kind of protected the paper from the ink, or I should say blocked the ink from getting to the paper in these spots. And even though the paper is dry, I've still got to be very careful with removing it, going section by section and not trying to rush it. So don't make particularly large sweeping movements, keep it quite tight, and you can brush bits off as you go. Personally, I find this to be a really satisfying process. It's quite fun, it's a little bit of a surprise. You're never 100% sure how it's going to turn out, and so that's definitely one of my favourite parts of working with masking fluid. You can see it's quite a crisp line. All the edges are very sharp. The crispness of it is actually why I like using it as well, because it's very suited for drawing. But if you want something with more of like a brush stroke feel, then something like Arabic gum might be better. This next step is just I'm adding little bits of shading and detailing, and I say it could be optional because you might just be happy with the finished result of the masking fluid having come off, but personally I quite like adding in these extra textures which just give the sort of finer details and adds a little bit more depth to the image. So the tool that I'm actually using is the Joseph Gillot mapping pen. You can get mapping pens from a bunch of different places, and they're a type of dip pen, but they're very, very fine, and you can get these really delicate lines, but with a little bit more pressure, and depending on your angle, it can also be quite thick. So it's like a whole entire pen set in this one little nib, which I really love. And you can just, normal fine liners are great. You can still use those. It doesn't have to be a dip pen. But what's nice is if you've got like different coloured inks, you can use this with all of them. In this case, I'm just dipping it into that same pot of Indian ink I was using earlier. The way that I'm applying the detail here is it's just very casual. I'm not overthinking about it. Generally on the stems, I'm not adding detail to both sides. I just stick to one, and it's almost sort of like almost in a shadow sort of way. And just it helps make it pop a little bit, and it just makes everything a little bit more three-dimensional and textured, as the image at the moment is all flat and on one sort of plane. I think it needs a little bit more texture to contrast the sort of flat matte black of the background. So for these leafy parts, I've also added a bit of a shading in the kind of almost traditional cross-hatching sort of way, where it's just sort of a few lines going across. You can just see here, it's just a little bit of shading, and that just sets some parts further back, so not everything's sort of on the same level. And I'm just trying to also make some of the stems look a little bit more defined from the leaves. There's not a specific amount that you need to do, just keep going until you feel like it's right. I personally decided that I still wanted a little bit of something else, and I've got this gold. So this is schmincke aqua bronze, and it's a pale gold, and you just mix it with a little bit of water. So it's a powder, and what I love about it is that most of the metallic powders I have, you have to mix with quite strong, like solvent type liquids, whereas this, just a little bit of water, so it's nice and easy, and it's really, really shiny. So once that is mixed, you can start applying. I've decided to go along with the lines. I want it to be tidy and still going with that kind of contemporary modern vibe. And I do like for it to feel quite designed when I'm adding the gold. What I like about using metallic is just the way it can lift the image and catches the light, so it gives that sort of extra texture. Other mediums which are good for adding a metallic touch are like gold leaf. It's a bit of a surprise at the end, but it's a lovely texture to it. This is actually the same paint that I'm using now, and you can see the finish is lovely. Sometimes a gold splatter as well is a different way of adding that kind of shine to the piece. So you can see here, it's just little bit by little bit, and the brush I'm using is just a very fine brush. I think it's just the sort of thing that you would normally use for like model making or something, but it's very easy to control. And when adding to the leaves here, I am being careful not to apply too much. It's just little thin swishes of the gold. I want to avoid it looking like a sort of sideways Christmas tree. So little bits, and it's just for the sake of the balance in the picture, and I think it'll help catch the light in the way that plants do sometimes. There's little gleams. So you can see how it is here, and it's just gentle, and we want to keep it still quite stylish, but fun as well, not too serious. When it comes to the framing, If you're using a textured paper like I have, then it's better to have a frame which is set back from the glass so that the artwork's not touching it. I've just quickly grabbed something quite clean and modern, but you can imagine if you had done this artwork in, say, like a teal and gold, then you could have popped it into a fun, like, dusty sage frame. But thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed my artwork and ramblings.